All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Encouraging Adult Learners to Vote. So before I begin, I do want to turn your attention to your controls on the bottom. So first you'll have a hand raise icon. So throughout the webinar, at a certain point, we're gonna want to do a little bit of discussion. In order to do that, we'd like you guys to raise your hand if you have something to contribute, and we can unmute you and then you can speak on the actual webinar. So please, start thinking about your mic setup. Just make sure that your mic is working. So we also have the chat icon on the bottom. So the chat is where we'd like to encourage you guys to speak to each other and speak to us, share resources and share ideas through the chat, please. I do want to point out that when you go to the chat, I just ask that you click the little drop down button that says to all panelists and change it to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your chat. Okay, so the next thing you should have is the Q&A. So the Q&A is where you're gonna put your questions that you have for the presenters, or if you have any technical questions. Technical questions will be answered privately via the chat. The actual questions that are related to the content will be read out loud so that everyone can benefit from them. All right, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Greg.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. I'm Greg Smith, Executive Director of Florida Literacy Coalition, and I want to welcome you this afternoon to our webinar on encouraging adult learners to vote. Appreciate your joining us for this session. As adult educators, you can really be instrumental in helping to educate and empower adult learners who may be new to the voting process or not familiar with how to vote, or maybe even not even sure if voting is worthwhile. They may be skeptical about, whether their vote makes a difference. Voting is certainly one of our most important rights and responsibilities as citizens of the United States, and many people think that this election coming up, this national election, may be one of the most important and consequential in decades. So you all can play an instrumental role in helping students become comfortable with the voting process and knowledgeable about how to go about doing it and why it's important. I think you'll find that if you engage students in this topic, you really can get them excited about how they can make a difference. So today we're going to highlight some information on voting, the importance of voting. We formatted the slides in such a way that we've used a simple, plain language approach to most of the slides, not all of them, but especially the ones on the voting process. So the notion here was to provide you with a tool right from the get-go that you can take and modify. These slides will be made available. It's PowerPoint slides, and you should be able to take these and change them and customize them to meet your needs. Obviously, in adult ed, we're working with students with a range of different skill levels, some of them to more beginning level right up through more advanced GED prep and so forth. So depending on your audience, you may want to use different language, but we've kind of catered this to more lower level, or at least intermediate level students. And so let's go ahead and get started. So in the United States, as you probably know, you must be 18 years of age to vote. In Florida, you need to, of course, be a resident of Florida, and you need to register to vote. You can't just show up. There are some special exceptions, people who've been adjudicated not mentally competent to vote, sort of outlier type situations, felons, people who are incarcerated, or people who are ex-felons. Most ex-felons. I think there are exceptions for people who have been convicted of murder and sexual assault. Otherwise, the voters or the citizens of Florida voted last time to restore the rights of ex-felons. And that is actually in the courts right now because as you may know, the state legislature passed a law after that constitutional amendment was passed. And basically stated that, which stated that fines and fees, court-related fines and fees need to be paid before ex-felons can vote. So that's in the courts right now, but for this election cycle, that certainly is the case. So there is an organization called Restore Your Vote that's helping ex-felons to pay those fines and fees, and it also is a good resource for information about how to go about doing that process. Now, there's not a formal process. You basically can vote as a felon, as I understand it, if you no longer have any fines or fees that you're responsible for. I think it's important to make sure that students know that their voting is private, especially if they're from countries where that may be called into question. And certainly no one knows how you're voting at any given time. Why voting? Okay. Well, one of the greatest ways I think you can have impact on the future, or actually to share with students the way that they can have impact on the future of their communities and their states and the United States, is to vote. Government at all levels has an effect on our lives in many ways. And as voters, we should share, we share equal power in choosing leaders to represent us in government. So one thing, I think it's a cool concept to share it. Most people probably know, but that your vote, any one of our votes, counts as much as anybody else's. So even the most politically and powerful, the wealthiest people in our society, their votes are equivalent to any one of us. And if you look at the data, certainly certain demographic groups are less likely to vote. Our students are represented among some of these demographic groups in pretty good numbers. African Americans, Hispanics, low-income individuals, young people traditionally are sort of underrepresented when it comes to voting. And for example, in 2016, our last national election, only 46% of young people 18 to 26 years of age voted, as compared to 61%, which was the national average. And elected officials certainly know this. They notice who votes and who doesn't, and they know they must pay attention to those issues that voters care about. Voting, your vote counts. I think understandably people sometimes are skeptical as to whether, it really makes a difference. They make the effort to vote, and will it make a difference? And I think this is an area that you can really spend some, have some interesting discussions on, and give some examples. We've listed one here. That's probably the most prominent example, but it happens all the time where in local elections in particular, elected officials are voted in with just a few votes. Sometimes it's even a tie. Here in Florida, as I'm sure many of you are aware, back in 2000, Florida played an instrumental role in the national election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, where 537 votes here in Florida really made the difference in who won the presidency, or decided who won the presidency. So it's hugely important. In Florida in particular is important because of our status as an important battleground state that really makes our votes, and not to say that our votes count more than others, but certainly they're sought after in ways that that other states are not pursued by elected officials. I wanted to draw your attention to a guide here that New Readers Press puts out. So this is one of the ones that we looked for resources that were really sort of plain language, written at a pretty easy level. Not a whole lot out there, unfortunately. And that's part of why we're doing this, because we wanted to share some stuff that, really allows you to hone in pretty quickly on stuff that's maybe at a level that your students can read and comprehend. This is one of the best ones we were able to find, News for You. You may be familiar with. It has a regular publication with news, and they did this special supplement. I who votes, reasons to vote. Now, this is all done at a national level, so it's not Florida specific, of course, but a lot of it is certainly relevant and can provide some good discussion guides for you. Choosing a president, talking a little bit about political parties, getting informed, watching debates, and so forth. So you can see that this is a resource that at least we feel that can be really useful in the classroom. So we'll be highlighting a few of these as we go along. Okay, so going back. There's an opportunity here, I think, to do some interesting civics lessons around voting and how there have been many people over the history of this country that fought long and hard for the right to vote. Some of them even gave their lives. Civil rights movement, women's suffrage movement, which lasted over 90 years. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in 1920. Folks like Susan B. Anthony, a women's suffrage leader, spent her entire adult life working for the right to vote and died 14 years before that right was secured. And the recent death of John Lewis brought to light sacrifices made by him and others during the civil rights cause movement, fighting for equality of rights to vote. In 1965 was the Voting Rights Act, which really wasn't all that long ago when you think about it. Before then, communities and states prevented African Americans from voting with literacy tests and poll taxes and even threats of violence. All these groups here represented on the screen were unable to vote at one point. So, as people are, debating whether they want to take the trouble to vote or not, I think it's always good to remind them that a lot of people fought long and hard for the right to vote. Issues. Now, I think this presents a great opportunity to discuss issues that are important for your students. And I love doing this kind of activity with students. What issues do they most care about? And how can voting really help to address these issues? There's lots of protests in the news recently, in recent months. And certainly the right to protest is fundamental under our Constitution. And protesting can be a great way to help affect change, but nothing is more powerful than the ballot box in affecting change. So here's just a few of the issues that are sort of in the news these days, and having some discussion around one or all of these, whatever really resonates with your students. The minimum wage piece here is really something they'll be able to vote on directly in this election, as there's a constitutional amendment that allows for people to vote on whether they want to increase the minimum wage. So these are all issues that, and many more, that really can have profound impacts on our lives. And so having some discussion around issues, I think, can often, at least my experiences, can be really a huge motivator to get folks, or help people understand why it's important and, motivate them to vote. So at this point, I'd like to, ask folks, as Nicole referenced earlier, if you can raise your hand there if you're interested in weighing in, or you can do it in the chat as to what you've done. We'd love to hear what you've done or plan to do to get students motivated to vote. So do we have any volunteers?
All right, Lisa Montgomery, I went ahead and asked you to unmute.
I'm a teacher in adult ed. I put together a PowerPoint, not the same as this one about, trying to get people to vote, but more about how do you vote, how do you register to vote. I put links in it so that they can go right to it. Duval County is where I live, and Duval County has a really good website. Florida has a good website. The News to You was very good. That helped me a lot, the voter's guide from News for You. But mine is just basically going to answer questions like, how do you vote? What do you have to do to vote? Where do you vote? Who do you vote for? Who's going to be on the ballot? What's the ballot look like? Things like that.
Okay, great. we're going to be sharing some of that. So we'd love to compare notes and maybe have you weigh in if you have some resources that we're not aware of, because that whole process side is really important. So thanks for sharing that. Have you been doing anything around sort of the having discussions around encouraging or motivating students to vote? Or do you find that they're already pretty motivated?
I did back in 2018. I haven't yet. I'm going to make that a part of this, the PowerPoint that I do. I think I'm going to take some of your, that's why I'm here, get some clues from y'all.
Right.
No other takers for speaking live. We do have some people in the chat putting what they've done.
Okay.
So Joseph Sinney says, at Learn to Read St. John's, we cover many of these issues with our adult students, especially our ESOL students who are preparing to take the citizenship test.
Okay. Yeah, this is a great tie-in with citizenship. Absolutely.
And Jerry is mentioning that they're bringing sample ballots to class to review with the students.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's go ahead and move on, and we'll have an opportunity at the end too to have folks weigh in as well. So going ahead here. How to register to vote. So this is getting into sort of more of the mechanics and the process of voting. So this is a website you definitely need to know about through the Florida Department of State and the registertovote.gov. Now, registration deadline this year is the 5th of October, so not too long away, just a couple weeks away. So this is a good time to really be promoting this, especially if students have not yet registered to vote. Of course, election day is on November 3rd. So I'm going to go over to this website here and share with you what this looks like. So when you click on that registertovote.gov, you get this website, and this is all in English and Spanish. Unfortunately, those are the only two languages that they make available at this point. And you can register to vote here. And then if folks are already registered, you can click over here. And, you know, my experience is that sometimes people don't really remember if they've registered, because most people in the state of Florida register when they get their driver's license. So that might be, you know, decades ago in some cases. So if they haven't voted as of late, and by that, you know, last 8 to 10 years, there is a chance that they've been removed, their records have been removed. If that's the case, they'll need to re-register, and they can find out here if they're registered to vote. So if you go in and you just put in your name and your birth date, it'll bring up a record, and every one is a little bit different because it goes back. Well, the first screen is at the state level, but then most of the information is provided because it provides a direct link to your local election board and election supervisor. And all of those websites look a little bit different, so we're not going to dig down too deep on this because it's a little bit of a different experience in terms of the look and feel, depending on each of the websites, but they all have the same information, which is basically, this is a great way to get 4 pieces of information that'll be useful to your students. One is to confirm their registration. If they're registered, make sure that their information is correct, address and so forth. They can also get their polling place. So where do they vote if they choose to vote on election day? They can get a sample ballot that'll be specific to who they're going to be voting on. And then they can also request a vote by mail ballot if they want to vote by mail this time. And that is, and it's a little bit different from state to state here in Florida. You do need to request that ballot. You don't need a reason to do it. Just, you know, that's your preference that you want to request a vote by mail ballot, and you can do it that way. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. You are in Florida given the option to vote in primary elections. We're not going to talk a lot about voting in primary elections. If you're interested in doing that, you do need to register with a particular party, you know, Democratic or Republican Party. But anybody can vote in this election. And certainly you don't have to align yourself with a party, but if you, for future elections, want to vote in a primary, you will need to do that. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to talk about 3 different ways to vote here in Florida.
All right, so we just want to spend a couple of slides just going through the ways to vote and resources to share with your adult learners on how they can find their specific information. So we're going to go over voting in person on election day, voting early, and voting by mail. So Greg, to make this easy, I think I'm just going to ask you to navigate for me, if that's all right.
Sure.
So if you can go to the next page. All right, so voting on election day is pretty much exactly as it sounds. It's going to your polling place on election day and voting in a voting booth. There are a few things that we want to emphasize and make sure that we cover when we're speaking with adult learners about voting on election day. So one is finding where they need to vote, and the other one is their ID requirements. So the voter lookup, information lookup, is the best way to find your polling place, and that was the site that Greg just showed you. So when you put in your information, you can find whether or not you're registered, and if you are, you find your polling place and some other information on there. So I won't show the website right now since you've already gotten it once. So what adult learners do need to know is that they will need a form of ID. Specifically, they'll need a photo ID with their signature on it. So here we have a list of IDs. These are the more common IDs that they might have. However, there is a full list of photo IDs, and in the presentation that I'll be sending around, I've linked the photo IDs to this slide right here. So I also want to emphasize that the voter ID is actually not required. So if someone does not have their voter ID card, I certainly don't. But if they don't, they can still vote with another form of ID. All right, next slide. Okay, so the next one I want to go over is voting by mail. I'm sorry, voting early. So this is a good option. It's usually less crowded, and it might be preferable to those who want to vote in person but want to avoid the crowds. So the equipment used during early voting is the same that's used on election day. Early voting in each county is different, but each county makes early voting available at least 10 days before the election and must end 3 days before the election. So here we have a site that lists each of the voting sites. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab the controls from you, Greg, and just show the site real quick. Okay, so this is the early voting locations and times by county. I do want to note that this is for the 2020 primary election. Typically, this doesn't change, especially since this was only a month ago. However, I would recommend that you go and double check that this is the correct early voting location for you, since this has not been updated yet, unfortunately. And also keep an eye out. It might actually get updated later on, and you will have this link as well in the PowerPoint. All right, so voting by mail. This has been in the news a lot, but for our purposes, we're just going to go over the mechanics of voting by mail. So a vote by mail ballot refers to a ballot that you request to have mailed to you before Election Day. So this is obviously a popular option right now, since you don't have to physically be there in person to vote. However, this process is more complicated. And since it's time sensitive, it's important to go over with this information with your adult learners if they do indeed want to vote by mail, or they express that they want to vote by mail. So you can find the application for getting a ballot at each county supervisors of elections website. So I'm going to go ahead and show this site. I do want to point out that each site is going to be different. This is the main page. It's pretty nice because you can actually select your city, and it will show you the county. So if they're not sure which county they're in, they could just put in their city. And then you click over to your county's website. I can show you Orange real quickly, but like I said, each county is in charge of their own site. So these are going to vary wildly from each other. Some are very easy to navigate and others not so much. But you can find all the information here. For Orange County, it's going to be under voters. But again, it's different for each one. So my suggestion to everyone here would be to actually go into this website and check and kind of do a look through of the county site, just to familiarize yourself with it. So when you are teaching this to adult learners, if they have a question, you at least know how to get to a specific area of the site. So your request for a mail-in ballot has to include specific things. So the request has to include the voter's name, their address, date of birth, and if they're filing online, the email address of the voter. So the ballot must be received by election day. It can't be postmarked by election day. So if you are nervous or your student is nervous about it not arriving on time, there are actually Dropbox locations, designated Dropboxes. So you can find that at your County Supervisors of Elections website. For Orange County, it's actually going to be the early voting locations, but I can't say that's true of every single county. So you definitely have to check with your specific county's website. So there's also a hotline here that that you could call, or your students can call if there are any further questions. And we'll show you there's also some pretty extensive FAQs on the website as well, and we'll show you that towards the end of the presentation. So that's the voting process for all three ways to vote. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Greg.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. So let's talk a little bit about what will be on the ballot. So as we referenced earlier, you can get a sample ballot for what you're going to need to vote on the statewide website. And sample ballots are also mailed to folks ahead of time. So everybody who's a registered voter should be receiving a sample ballot. Everybody's ballot is the same. So I'm going to just share with you one sample ballot for my county, Seminole County. And everybody's ballot in Florida is the same. So we don't have any more hanging chads or any other varying systems that, change from county to county. The system has been made uniform. And so everybody, it's a, 1 or 2 page type thing like this one. And, you basically, and it's probably good to work through this with your students. A blue or black pen, you need to make your selection. We don't have any statewide offices. Well, there is a Supreme Court justice, but this is an off-year election in terms of our statewide, governors and lieutenant governor and other, offices, attorney general and so forth. So those are not going to show up on the ballot, nor do we have any Senate races, U.S. Senate races, but they will be given the option to vote on who they want in Congress, and certainly a lot of local elections. And I would encourage you just to talk through this a little bit with your students. Now, your students, even if they live in the same county, may not always have the exact same ballot. It's probably going to be very close, but there may be certain people that some folks are voting on in terms of local elections, county commissioners and so forth, that others aren't voting on, depending on what district they're in. In fact, that's a likelihood that would be the case. One thing that's really important to communicate is that they are not required to vote on everything. because, most people, myself included, are not very knowledgeable about all these folks, especially, judges and other positions. Now, we wouldn't want anybody to feel overwhelmed by the process that they have to, study up on every one of these ballot options. But, it probably would be good, at least for the major offices, to do some homework. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that here shortly. So, so that's an example of a ballot, and just sort of working through it with your students is a good idea. And seeing if they have any questions, and it's also an opportunity to maybe talk about some certain elements of the ballot, including the Florida amendments. So in Florida, as many of you I'm sure know, we have a process that allows for the state constitution to be amended through these referenda, these ballot referenda. You need to get 60% of the vote in Florida in order to have a ballot measure pass in terms of constitutional amendment ballot measure. There are 6 on this ballot, and I think this is really the area where people get the most confused, because the language, unfortunately, on these things is not always very clear and understandable. And so that's a challenge. So there's six amendments this time. And there was a constitutional convention that only convenes every, I think it's like 20 years or something like that. So there's a few that are rather kind of interesting. You wouldn't necessarily see, these are kind of smaller issues. There's 3 that I would say that are not as consequential to most people, that folks probably should still know about, but there's 2 that have to do with the homestead property tax discount, expanding the ability to transfer that, or allowing for a surviving spouse of a deceased veteran. I mean, it gets very specific. There's one ballot referenda on stating that just a small change in the language of the Constitution, that you have to be 18 years of age to vote, which in reality, everywhere in Florida, you do have to already be 18 years of age to vote. So, that really wouldn't probably have an effect, but that's sort of a cleanup type thing that the Constitutional Convention did. Some folks, like the League of Women Voters, are opposed to that because they say it's really not necessary. I mean, but the net effect will be very minimal. But there's 3 that are pretty significant in terms of their potential impact. I've listed 2 of them here. One is Amendment 4, which basically will make the process for amending the state constitution much more difficult. So right now, as I mentioned, you have to get 60% of the vote. And actually prior to that, you have to get a certain number of signatures. I don't remember exactly what it is. It's a very high number of signatures to get on the ballot. And then once you're on the ballot, you need to get 60% of the vote. This amendment would require that same ballot measure, that same amendment question, go to a second election. And you have to get 60% of the vote in a second election. So it needs to be basically the same thing, needs to be approved twice. So a yes vote supports that the changes to the Constitution to approve this measure, and a no vote would mean that you're against it. Another amendment, which is a lot more sort of self-explanatory, but I think probably quite important to a lot of our students, is minimum wage initiative to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour in the year 2026. So basically, the minimum wage would go up by, I believe, $1 a year until the year 2026. There's a third measure that I haven't listed here, but it has to do with, and it's also pretty consequential, on the voting primary process. And basically, it's sort of following the way of a few states, California, Washington State, Louisiana, to basically have a process where you don't really do sort of the kind of primary elections that we do now, where each party selects a candidate, and then there's a Republican and a Democrat on the main ballot. but instead it would have that the top 2 vote getters, regardless of party, would be on the final ballot, the election ballot for the main election. So it could be 2 Democrats, could be 2 Republicans. So that one is a little bit harder to kind of take a look at, what's the pros and cons. There's a series here, the public radio, that's being run on public radio here in Florida, that really dives into this issue, as well as the issue on the required constitutional amendment to be passed twice, and they have some good articles. I'm not sure, these are recently out. I'm not sure if they're going to be doing one on all the amendments or not. Some of the amendments aren't quite as consequential, and they may not be doing that. So I'm just not sure. But the ones that I think are potentially most confusing to folks, Amendment 4, and then the other one's Amendment 3 on the primary election process. You can also go to Ballotpedia. Now, we've worked with a professor from Lynn University, Robert Watson, who does a plain language guide to the constitutional amendments in Florida. He has not published it yet, but I have been in communication with him, and he said he is planning to do it, and hopefully it'll be out in the next week or 2. So we'll add it to our website. We're going to be sharing resources that we've added to the website here as soon as it comes out. So be on the lookout for that, because he's done a nice job in the past really trying to simplify what the amendment's all about, talks a little bit about, what change it'll affect, and also shares some information about different groups that are in favor of it or are not in favor of any given amendment. So this is probably the part of the ballot, and again, that's most complex, but these are important questions that are being put to the voters of Florida. Getting informed, this is a big piece of it. How do you get information? I think you can really do some fun stuff around talking with students about how to stay informed, finding trustworthy, reliable, truthful news sources for their information, asking them, where do they get their information, and they, is it, this sort of trend in recent years where what's been going on for a little while, where people tend to be, relying on 1 or 2 sources of news, and that have a certain point of view. So listening to TV and radio, what's online, newspapers and magazines, campaign ads, yes, I mean, those sort of definitely, share perspective, but that's part of the process too. Candidates' websites on particular issues, talking with people that and trust and feel, have some knowledge that might be useful, to have some discussion, some dialogue. And we're not encouraging to be, try to be nonpartisan, I think, and it's important to, not, I think, sort of be sharing too much about, or advocating for one particular view over another, but certainly helping people to find good, reputable sources, because a lot of stuff online definitely is, biased in one direction or another, and it's difficult sometimes to really differentiate, because they look equally polished, the sources online, and they look credible, but in many cases they're definitely, espousing a particular point of view. In some cases they can be misleading or unfactual. So talking with students about how they get their news, and it's an opportunity to talk about sort of the whole story around Russian government attempts in the last national election, and there looks like there's evidence they're trying to do the same this time to influence our national election, largely through the use of social media. And Phil Anderson with the Department of Education shared a good resource that we added to our resource list called Common Sense Media, that basically delves into this issue, and has videos and sources on how to determine, helping people understand how to determine credible news sources, and especially as it relates to social media. And so PolitiFact. You're probably knowledgeable about PolitiFact. That's a website that basically looks at various claims that public officials and others make, and basically has sort of a truth meter that they tie to it, and whether something's truthful or sort of mostly truthful or mostly untruthful or untruthful. And I think their lowest rating is pants on fire, liar, liar, pants on fire. And so, so that's an interesting website that you can use with your student to kind of look at some of the, what's being said, during elections. And this is certainly not, unique to our current culture. I mean, this has happened for, since the beginning of our country, where claims are made in elections that are not truthful, or and certainly are biased in certain directions. So being able to kind of parse that and find reliable websites that you can look to get information to be an informed voter is important. I want to put in a quick plug for the census. The census is winding down right now, and there's about 2 weeks, or the end of the month is when the final submissions have to be made. So hopefully all of your students have completed their census forms. If they haven't, it's not too late to do so. They probably got a knock on the door, perhaps. Excuse me. But if they haven't, this is really important. Role of citizenship to be counted. A lot of policy decisions, a lot of money is tied to the census count that's only done every 10 years. So on our website, we have a variety of resources, lesson plans, webinars, and so forth. So please, if you haven't talked with your students about this, please do so, because it's really important. And with that, I want to turn it back over to Nicole, who's going to walk through our website that's aligned with all this information that we put together. And we did this in part because there's a lot of good national websites out there, but there wasn't a whole lot in terms of Florida specific websites that really had sort of lesson plans, activities, and sort of plain language materials. So we did our best to kind of pull some stuff together, and we want to share that with you now.
All right, so I'm just going to quickly go over, as Greg said, the guide that we've put together. Okay, so this is going to be the 2020 guide for adult learners. So here we have like a FAQ, a general FAQ. So there's drop downs for when election day is, who can vote. It's essentially what we covered in this webinar. There's also a downloadable PDF. So if you would like to print it, you could do that as well by downloading the PDF. So it's the same information in a PDF form. All right. So a lot of the stuff that we mentioned here, including resources, are on this page. So if you were to click on instructional resources, these are resources that you could use in your classroom that we thought were pretty high quality. This is the one that Greg had mentioned earlier, the Common Sense Media. Pretty much everything else we've covered in the webinar today, plus additional resources, are going to be here. And then we have some informational resources like the Department of State website, how to register to vote online. Rock the Vote is another really great voting resource to get information. They also have kind of little embeddable things that you can put into your website for voter registration lookup. And yeah, that's our site. So Greg, I thought maybe we could do some questions really quickly.
Go ahead and do some questions. I wanted to point out that there is a video there under that that informational resource that you may want to show your students. The woman talks pretty quickly, unfortunately, but you can always stop it. So if you want to use video resources, in fact, there's a number of video resources that are part of those materials that we shared, various links, but most of them are national. So that one is specific to Florida, so you might want to check that out. And Aisa worked this up with Nicole, so thank you both for doing that. A nice job. Aisa just pointed out in the chat that if you are going to vote by mail, you do need to make sure that your signatures match. So that's an important piece, and that's been in the news a lot. Some controversy around voting by mail, and in some of the primaries where this has been done or other elections, sometimes ballots have been dismissed because the signature doesn't match. So if you've changed your signature, just bring this to your students' attention, or, I mean, it doesn't have to be exact, but, somebody's going to look at it and kind of make a judgment that it's the same signature. Now, if you're voting in person, either early voting or on election day, that's really not an issue because you have your identification. So they're really looking in the vote by mail that the signature is sort of taking the place of the identification. So that's more important for the vote by mail. So just something to keep in mind. So why don't we go ahead and open it back up. Any questions that folks have or comments in terms of what they're doing or planning to do around this issue, you can either put it in the chat box, as Nicole mentioned, or raise your hand if you'd like to share it verbally.
All right, so we do have a comment, well, a question from Jerry that she posted a little while ago, and I thought this would be great if anybody had some answers to this. Has anyone had adult learners who have expressed concerns about voting, safety from COVID, or fear or concern their vote won't count? So if anyone has any kind of experience with that, you could raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can put it in the chat.
And I can share a little bit on the measures that have taken. I should have mentioned this earlier. So I did talk with somebody at the state election office, and she assured me that that measures are being taken in every county to make sure that voting is safe. In terms of there's a mass and distance in sanitizing stations after folks vote and things of that nature. So, not to say that there's no risk there, but they are taking measures from sort of a public health perspective to make it as safe as possible, both during the early voting opportunities as well as, on election day. The second issue around whether your vote counts, please. Well, the big part of this is, encouraging folks that their vote does count and can make a difference. But yeah, do other folks have any thoughts on that question? Because it definitely does come up. Were there any other questions, Nicole, or comments?
We have a couple of comments here that I think would be good to say out loud. Oh, Anne has something to say, so let me go ahead. Anne Bridenstine, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you so much, guys. This has been absolutely fantastic. Is there a number we can call, say we're mailing in our ballot, to make sure our ballot has been received?
Yes, there definitely is. The voter assistance hotline will be able to give you any questions. I will say, I'm not 100% sure if they're going to be able to answer your specific question, but that would be your best bet, honestly.
Well, yeah, I think I have a little insight into that. The voter assistance hotline is probably not the best place to start, but you can go into that voter information website that we mentioned, and it will tell you that your vote has been received. Once it's been logged. So you got to vote earlier than election day, so you can do that. But I mean, if you want to verify it before election day that it's been received, but yes, you can verify it that way. So that's all done through your local supervisor of elections. And you could also reach out to them. I probably, if you're not able to figure that out, you can contact the local supervisor of elections, and they can give you some insight onto how to, confirm that your vote's been received. I know people are worried about that.
Thank you.
All right, so Mary Stevens, you have your hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk and unmute you.
Hi, I just wrote it in the chat. I just learned that the census could be extended up until October 31st. I think I heard the decision is probably going to be made today. Not too sure.
Oh, okay.
Thank
Yes.
you. Enjoyed the webinar immensely. It was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I've downloaded
Okay, well, thank
the
you.
materials. Yeah, because we do get questions about it, and I'm much more prepared now. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for that Insight, yes, that, and I should have mentioned that is in the courts now. So I had not heard that it might be resolved as early as tomorrow. So that's good. But yes, the original there was an extension to the October 30th, and then the Trump administration rolled that back to September 30th, and that was then challenged by a number of organizations and being litigated. So, so there is a chance that yes, that it may be extended to October. But I would still encourage folks to talk with your students about that sooner than later, because you know, you want to, don't wait the last minute on that kind of thing. You want to get that information in.
All right, so we have a comment here from Lisa, which I think is pretty important. Make sure to tell your students to fill in the oval. Check marks or X's are no good in regards to the ballot.
Excellent point. Yes, no check marks. You gotta fill it in. Yep, on the whole circle.
Let's see, we have another comment here. Regarding mail-in ballots, signatures on the ballots need to match what the record is at the supervisor of elections office.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Okay, so someone said it was hard to hear Mary's comment, but what she said was essentially that the census would be, may be extended. We may get a decision on it today. Or tomorrow, I'm sorry. All right, and I think that's all we have for questions.
Okay, one other quick thing. People, I've received a couple of mailers that have asked, you know, or given, you know, they have a form basically that say you can request a vote by mail. And I did check with the voter hotline on this, and they said basically there are a number of nonprofit organizations that are sending these out. The one I received was from a group called the Center for Voter Information. I really looked at it carefully, and it does look legitimate, and they verified this, that if it's, you know, it's basically asking for the voter name and date of birth and a signature. So people are getting these in the mail. You know, Florida, again, is a very important state this election cycle. And so folks really are making an extra effort here in Florida to get the vote out. The important caveat here is that it's being mailed back to either the state supervisor of elections or local supervisor of elections. In this case, you don't want to do anything, because some of the stuff out there is not very reputable. You don't want to be mailing anything to a party or candidates and things of that nature when it comes to those kinds of vote by mail requests. And I'm not saying that there are candidates that are doing that, but any kind of you know, questionable place to mail those requests would be a red flag. So, but you know, people may be getting, your students may be getting those in the mail, and you know, the safest way is to go on the website like we shared, and you can update all your information right there. But folks some people are getting these mailers. So unless there's any other comments that have come in here in the last minute or two, Nicole, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Was there anything else? I'm taking a quick look here too. Okay, doesn't look like it. And actually, we're at the end of our hour. So thank you, Nicole. Thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Really do hope that you have some interesting conversations with your students to get out and let their voice be heard through the ballot box. So you all have a great afternoon.